It began with a letter taped crookedly to the front gate, flapping in the morning breeze like an ominous flag. The homeowner, a quiet resident of the Willowbrook Estates community, noticed it as they returned from their usual early walk. The paper, printed with the HOA's bold, block-lettered logo, was impossible to ignore. The headline was even worse: Mandatory Correction Notice. The message was cold and clinical. The HOA board had deemed the front fence unsightly and non-compliant with community aesthetics. The letter listed a series of violations in precise, numbered points, citing faded paint, visible wood grain, and a detrimental visual impact on neighborhood property values. The homeowner was given 30 days to repaint it in one of 3 approved colors: beige, off-white, or light gray. Anything else would result in daily fines. The fence in question was an old cedar barrier, weathered but sturdy, stretching along the front of the property like a seasoned guard. The wood had aged naturally into a silver-gray patina, dotted with darker knots and streaks from years of rain and sunlight. It was a fence with character, but the HOA saw only imperfection. The homeowner had known the HOA could be picky. They had seen other neighbors get written up for mailbox styles or lawn decorations. But a fence? That felt absurd. The letter's tone was condescending, as if the homeowner were a negligent renter instead of someone who had spent years paying for and caring for their home. They decided to think on it. A weekend passed, then a week. The letter sat on the kitchen counter, growing more irritating each time they glanced at it. The HOA's board members, most notably its president, a stern woman with a permanent scowl, had been known to drive by homes to check compliance. Sure enough, within days, there were slow cars passing in front of the house, pausing just long enough to make their scrutiny obvious. Something about the situation gnawed at the homeowner. The fence wasn't falling apart, wasn't unsafe, and certainly wasn't lowering anyone's property values. Yet the HOA's demand wasn't framed as a request. It was an order. That was the moment a small spark of defiance began to form. The homeowner began researching the HOA's own bylaws. They found vague language about harmonious neighborhood appearance, but nothing explicitly banning creativity. Only a requirement that exterior paint be non-offensive and in keeping with community standards. Those standards were never clearly defined, which meant there was a loophole. Still, the 30-day clock was ticking. The fines would start soon, and the HOA would relish the opportunity to tack them onto the homeowner's account. In the evenings, the homeowner sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, sketching ideas. One idea stood out: bold, risky, and just petty enough to satisfy the growing resentment. If the HOA wanted the fence repainted, fine. But instead of choosing beige or gray, the homeowner would turn the fence into something no one in Willowbrook Estates could ignore. A trip to the hardware store was made, but not for muted colors. Instead, buckets of bright, high-quality exterior paints were loaded into the trunk. Electric blues, blazing reds, vivid yellows, and deep purples. The cashier raised an eyebrow but said nothing. For days, the homeowner worked in secret. Early mornings before most neighbors were awake. Late evenings when the street was quiet. The fence transformed panel by panel, each one becoming part of a sprawling, colorful mural. Landscapes, abstract swirls, hidden symbols. The design evolved into a vibrant tapestry of art stretching the entire length of the property. By the time the final brushstroke was laid, the fence looked less like a boundary and more like the outer wall of a street art gallery. It was loud, unapologetic, and impossible to call unsightly without admitting a bias against art itself. The homeowner stepped back, admiring the work. The paint glistened under the afternoon sun, colors so rich they seemed to hum with life. For the first time in weeks, they smiled. The HOA had wanted conformity. Instead, they got a statement. The next morning, the reaction began. Neighbors slowed their morning drives to stare. Some shook their heads, others smiled. A few took photos. By the third day, pictures of the fence started appearing on local social media groups, tagged with captions like, "Check out this house in Willowbrook Estates." And finally, someone standing up to the HOA. It wasn't long before the HOA's board took notice. And when they did, the quiet tension in Willowbrook Estates began to build into something much louder. The storm was coming, but so was something else. The fence wasn't just making waves in the neighborhood anymore. It was about to make headlines. The first official reaction from the HOA came in the form of another letter, this time delivered by certified mail. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, as if the weight alone was meant to intimidate. Inside was a multi-page notice of violation and demand for immediate rectification. The wording was sharp, accusing the homeowner of flagrant disregard for established community standards and willful provocation of neighborhood disharmony. It demanded that the mural be painted over immediately and replaced with one of the approved neutral colors. If the homeowner refused, the HOA threatened fines, legal action, and even the possibility of a lien against the property. But while the HOA bristled with fury, the neighborhood was buzzing with fascination. The fence had become the talk of Willowbrook Estates and beyond. Cars were now slowing to a crawl in front of the property, passengers leaning out to take photos. Joggers adjusted their routes to pass by, and cyclists stopped to point out details in the artwork. Someone even began tagging their Instagram posts with the hashtag #WillowbrookWall. At first, the attention was local, friends telling friends, neighbors telling relatives. But within a week, a local lifestyle blogger featured it in an article about hidden artistic gems in the suburbs. That post was shared hundreds of times, eventually catching the eye of a small regional news outlet. Soon, a photographer was standing outside the fence, capturing wide shots for an online feature. The article went live on a Friday morning, titled HOA Calls Fence an Eyesore, Community Calls It Art. It struck a nerve. Within hours, it was being shared on Facebook and Twitter, with thousands of comments flooding in. Some praised the homeowner's creativity and courage, while others used it as an example of HOA overreach. The mural's colors, patterns, and hidden designs became subjects of online discussion. People debated whether it was abstract or symbolic, whether certain shapes hinted at local history or personal stories. By the weekend, visitors began arriving from other neighborhoods, then from neighboring towns. Small groups stood on the sidewalk, taking selfies and pointing out details in the panels. Local coffee shops noticed the uptick in out-of-town customers, and some even suggested adding a Willowbrook wall latte to their menu as a joke. The HOA board, however, was far from amused. At their next meeting, the president's voice reportedly carried through the thin walls of the clubhouse as she ranted about the mockery of our community's reputation. According to whispered accounts, some board members urged a hardline legal approach, while others quietly admitted they didn't see what the problem was. But the president was determined. The HOA hired a property compliance inspector to officially document the fence, photographing it from multiple angles. They then sent the homeowner a formal final notice, with a deadline just 2 weeks away. The language was even more severe, warning that continued noncompliance will compel the board to seek judicial remedies. The homeowner read it in silence, but outside, the mural was taking on a life of its own. A local artist posted a video analyzing the fence's composition, noting how the bright red swirls drew the eye and how the contrasting blues and yellows created a sense of movement. That video alone got hundreds of thousands of views on TikTok, pulling in curious visitors from even further away. It was no longer just a neighborhood oddity. It was becoming a tourist attraction. People were posing in front of it for engagement photos, graduation pictures, even small fashion shoots. A group of art students arrived with sketchbooks, sitting cross-legged on the curb as they drew their own interpretations. With every visitor, the HOA's frustration deepened. Traffic on the usually quiet residential street increased, sometimes backing up as cars stopped to take photos. The president called it a circus and sent out a community-wide email urging residents to remember the dignity of our neighborhood. That email was leaked almost immediately, becoming yet another point of ridicule online. It was clear the battle lines had been drawn. On one side was the HOA, clinging to its authority and rules. On the other was a growing number of residents and strangers who saw the mural as something to celebrate. The homeowner stood in the middle, quietly watching the storm gather strength. And then came the day when a tour bus, painted in cheerful colors and labeled Local Wonders Tour, rolled slowly down the street and stopped in front of the house. Dozens of tourists stepped off, snapping photos and laughing. That was the moment the HOA realized they were no longer just dealing with one defiant homeowner. They were dealing with a phenomenon they couldn't control. The president's next move would be her boldest yet, and it would change the fight entirely. The arrival of the tour bus was the tipping point. Until that moment, the HOA could at least pretend the mural was a neighborhood matter, something that could be resolved quietly through letters, fines, and stern meetings. But the sight of 30 strangers crowding the sidewalk, posing for photos and blocking traffic, shattered that illusion. Within 24 hours, the HOA president called an emergency session of the board. The meeting notice, printed in all caps, was slid under every resident's door. The language was urgent, warning that the neighborhood's integrity is under direct threat, and decisive action must be taken to restore order. The homeowner, though not present at the meeting, could imagine the scene inside the HOA clubhouse. The long folding tables, the cheap coffee in styrofoam cups, the board members seated in a semicircle while the president paced in front of them. Reports would later filter out from sympathetic neighbors who had attended. The president had come armed with printed photos of the tour bus and screenshots from social media. She slammed them down for everyone to see, her voice sharp with outrage. Some board members worried about the optics of a legal fight. Others pointed out that the mural had sparked nothing but positive attention outside the community, even boosting local business. But the president dismissed these concerns as irrelevant. In her mind, this was about control. If one homeowner could defy the rules and turn their property into a spectacle, what would stop others from doing the same? Today it was a mural. Tomorrow it could be neon lawn sculptures or flashing holiday lights in July. The board voted 4-3 to authorize legal counsel. The HOA's attorney, a man known for his aggressive tactics, was given the green light to file for a court order demanding the mural's removal. The claim was simple. The fence violated the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and the homeowner's refusal to comply was damaging the uniform aesthetic of Willowbrook Estates. The homeowner received the notice by courier, its formal language cloaked in legal threats. Alongside the demand for immediate removal was an itemized list of fines, already totaling hundreds of dollars. The letter warned that if the matter went to court, the HOA would seek to recover attorney's fees, a veiled warning that fighting back could become financially ruinous. But outside the walls of the HOA's boardroom, the mural's popularity was only growing. The tour bus returned twice that week. A food truck set up nearby on Saturday morning, serving coffee and pastries to visitors. A local artists cooperative announced they would be hosting an art walk that included the mural as its centerpiece. Flyers advertising the event appeared on community bulletin boards, coffee shop counters, and even in the hands of teenagers passing them out at the mall. The HOA tried to counter the publicity by sending another email blast to residents, this time invoking safety concerns, claiming the increased foot traffic posed risks of theft, littering, and property damage. But the residents knew better. Visitors weren't vandals. They were polite, respectful, and often eager to shop at local stores or grab lunch nearby. The HOA's email was met with quiet defiance. Some residents began decorating their own fences with subtle splashes of color, small rebellions in solidarity with the mural. A few even set out lawn chairs in the afternoons to watch the parade of visitors. The homeowner's property had unintentionally become a gathering point, a place where neighbors chatted, laughed, and enjoyed themselves, something that hadn't happened in years. The HOA president, meanwhile, doubled down. She scheduled daily drive-bys past the property, taking photos from her car and filing incident reports about unauthorized gatherings. She even called the local police once, claiming the crowd was obstructing traffic. The officers arrived, took one look, and left without issuing any citations. That only fueled her frustration. Local reporters began digging deeper. Articles framed the conflict as a classic battle between artistic freedom and rigid bureaucracy. Interviews with visitors painted the homeowner as a quiet folk hero, someone who had brought joy to people far beyond the gated streets of Willowbrook Estates. The real blow to the HOA's control came when a state-level arts organization reached out. They wanted to feature the mural in a public campaign promoting community art. If the homeowner agreed, the mural would not only be photographed for promotional materials but also cataloged in the state's official registry of public artworks. That recognition would make it much harder for the HOA to argue the mural was merely a private nuisance. By the end of the month, the HOA's legal threat was overshadowed by something they hadn't anticipated. The mural had become too big to erase without making themselves look like villains. Yet the president refused to relent, convinced that losing this fight meant losing her authority entirely. And so, with legal papers ready to file and public opinion squarely against them, the HOA prepared to launch the next phase of their campaign. A public confrontation that would drag the dispute out of the letters and meetings and into the street for everyone to witness. The showdown was no longer a matter of if, but when. And when it came, it would draw more eyes than the HOA could possibly control. The day of the confrontation arrived not with a whisper, but with a slow, deliberate build-up that seemed almost inevitable. It began when the HOA president announced, via a sternly worded bulletin slipped into every mailbox, that she would be addressing the community regarding the fence situation. The notice hinted at urgent safety concerns and the preservation of neighborhood values, but everyone knew exactly what it was about. By late morning, the air in Willowbrook Estates felt charged. Neighbors trickled toward the corner where the mural stood, drawn by curiosity, quiet defiance, or a desire to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Visitors who had come to see the mural found themselves unwitting participants in something bigger. Phones were out, ready to record. Cars lined the street. Even a couple of reporters stood with cameras slung over their shoulders, waiting for the moment to begin. The HOA president arrived in a crisp blazer despite the warm weather, her expression fixed in a mask of authority. A clipboard was clutched tightly in one hand, a stack of documents in the other. Behind her came two other board members, one carrying a folder stuffed with printed photographs of the fence. They approached the property with purposeful strides, stopping directly in front of the mural as if staging the perfect shot for the evening news. The crowd formed a semicircle, a silent audience. The homeowner stood on the porch, arms folded, watching the scene without stepping forward. The president began her address, her voice loud, her tone cutting through the chatter. She spoke of rules, of unity, of property values under siege. She pointed to the mural like it was evidence in a criminal trial, describing it as a disruption, a hazard, and an act of willful defiance against the community's covenant. What she hadn't accounted for was the reaction. The crowd wasn't nodding along. They weren't muttering in agreement. Instead, they stood still, their faces unreadable, their phones recording every word. A few visitors quietly shook their heads. A small ripple of laughter passed through the onlookers when she described the mural as a threat to safety. The reporters captured it all. The grand gestures, the exaggerated warnings, the growing disconnect between her words and the reality everyone could see. Then came the turning point. A young visitor stepped closer to take a photo of the mural, angling their camera to capture the sunlight hitting the colors just right. The president, mid-sentence, snapped at them to move away. The crowd tensed. Her voice had risen sharply, and it echoed in the quiet street. The visitor didn't leave. Instead, they took another photo. Murmurs spread, the quiet hum of collective disapproval. The cameras kept rolling. The homeowner, still silent, walked down the steps and stood beside the fence, a calm presence in stark contrast to the president's agitation. Without words, the stance alone spoke volumes, ownership, pride, and a refusal to be intimidated. The crowd shifted subtly, almost like they were closing ranks around the homeowner, forming an unspoken shield. Sensing the moment slipping, the president tried to regain control. She held up papers, the official court filings prepared by the HOA's attorney, and declared that they would be enforced if the mural was not removed immediately. But instead of fear, the announcement drew a wave of whispered reactions. The visitors, many of whom were not even residents, exchanged looks of disbelief. Neighbors who had once stayed silent during HOA disputes now muttered openly about Overreach. And then, in an unplanned and perfectly timed twist, A man in a polo shirt approached carrying a clipboard of his own. He was from the state's Arts Council, there to officially document the mural for inclusion in the public art registry. The timing could not have been worse for the HOA president, or better for the homeowner. The man took photos, measured sections of the fence, and scribbled notes, all while the crowd watched. His presence carried an unspoken message. This wasn't just a neighborhood decoration anymore. It was art, recognized at a state level. The president's jaw tightened. Her speeches, her threats, her carefully constructed narrative had just been undercut in real time. She turned sharply, signaled to the other board members, and marched back to her car without another word. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. Instead, they lingered, chatting, taking photos, and congratulating the homeowner quietly. The tension that had been building for weeks had finally snapped, but not in the way the HOA had hoped. That evening, videos of the confrontation flooded social media. Clips of the president's raised voice, the laughter in the crowd, and the Arts Council representative's arrival went viral. Comments poured in from across the country, almost unanimously siding with the homeowner. The HOA had gone from an internal governing body to a public punchline in less than 24 hours. But victory was not yet certain. The court filing was still active. The HOA wasn't finished. They would regroup, strategize, and return with another plan. And as the homeowner watched the sunset reflect off the mural's colors, they knew the fight was far from over. The legal battle was coming, and it would be the most dangerous round yet. The weeks following the public confrontation were deceptively quiet. On the surface, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythms. Morning joggers, the sound of sprinklers, cars easing down the tree-lined streets. But beneath that calm, a legal storm was brewing. The HOA had retreated from the public eye, but not out of surrender. Behind closed doors, the board and their attorney were preparing for the courtroom showdown they had been threatening from the start. The homeowner received the official court summons on a gray Tuesday morning. It was thick with legal jargon, every page stamped and signed, laying out the HOA's case in painstaking detail. The central argument was that the mural violated the HOA's covenant by failing to conform to approved exterior aesthetics and detracting from neighborhood uniformity. They argued that the homeowner's refusal to comply set a dangerous precedent for others. And, as if to twist the knife, the HOA demanded the homeowner pay for the HOA's legal fees if they won. The homeowner understood the stakes immediately. Losing could mean not just repainting the fence, but also being saddled with thousands of dollars in costs. Yet fear didn't outweigh resolve. Public opinion was still overwhelmingly in their favor, and the mural's growing recognition as an official piece of public art offered a defense that could not be easily dismissed. The hearing was scheduled for late summer, giving both sides time to gather evidence. The HOA assembled an arsenal of photographs, each panel of the mural meticulously documented, and statements from board members about traffic congestion, property values, and aesthetic disruption. The president herself wrote a lengthy declaration, painting the homeowner as reckless and inconsiderate, intent on undermining the community's standards. The homeowner's defense was just as methodical. They brought in testimonials from neighbors who supported the mural, photographs showing the respectful behavior of visitors, and letters from local business owners who had seen increased sales due to the tourism it brought. Most importantly, they secured the support of the State Arts Council, which provided official documentation confirming the mural's status as a registered work of public art, a designation that carried legal weight. When the day finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. Curious locals filled the benches, while reporters jostled for position near the front. The HOA's president sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her attorney beside her, flipping through a binder thick with evidence. Across from them, the homeowner sat calmly with their legal counsel, a quiet determination in their posture. The proceedings began with the HOA's side. Their attorney spoke at length about the fragility of community harmony and how the fence's chaotic, loud design was incompatible with the serene aesthetic promised to residents. They presented photographs taken at odd angles to make the street appear more congested than it truly was, and played up the narrative of increased traffic as a neighborhood hazard. When it was the homeowner's turn, Their attorney dismantled the HOA's claims piece by piece. They showed timestamp security footage proving that foot traffic was orderly and never obstructed driveways. They presented expert testimony from an art historian who explained the cultural and communal value of public murals, especially those created organically within neighborhoods. The State Arts Council's representative testified, emphasizing that removal of the mural would be the destruction of a recognized piece of art, something that could trigger backlash far beyond Willowbrook Estates. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the photographs of the mural projected on the courtroom screen. There was an unspoken shift in the room each time the vivid colors filled the display, a reminder that the dispute wasn't over graffiti or decay, but over something that many considered beautiful. After hours of testimony and argument, the judge announced that the decision would be issued in writing within 2 weeks. Both sides left the courtroom without resolution, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The HOA's president avoided the cameras outside, while the homeowner was met with quiet words of encouragement from neighbors and strangers alike. The waiting period felt longer than the weeks leading up to the trial. The HOA maintained its silence, no longer issuing community-wide bulletins. The homeowner kept the mural in perfect condition, touching up the paint where the summer sun had begun to fade it, as if preparing it for whatever came next. When the letter from the court finally arrived, it carried the weight of months of conflict. The envelope sat unopened on the kitchen counter for a long moment, the air still, before it was finally sliced open. Inside was the ruling, a decision that would not just settle the fate of the mural, but define the balance of power between one homeowner and the HOA that had sought to control them. The verdict would not only decide the future of the fence, but would ripple through every street in Willowbrook Estates. By the time summer rolled around, the fence was no longer just a quirky neighborhood attraction. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. The once quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a constant parade of visitors. Families came to take selfies, bloggers wrote glowing reviews, and even a few art professors from the nearby university stopped by to give impromptu lectures about the democratization of public art. Local businesses caught wind of the trend and began cashing in. A coffee shop down the road started selling fence latte specials, while a bakery offered ugly fence cookies, shaped like little planks of wood. Food trucks began parking nearby on weekends, creating an almost festival-like atmosphere. What had started as one person's act of defiance had turned into a small-scale tourism industry, all centered around that single stretch of painted boards. The homeowner, now somewhat of a local celebrity, had embraced the attention. They started hosting monthly Fence Fridays, where a new mural segment was revealed to the public, each one telling a small part of an ongoing story. Local artists were invited to contribute, and each piece reflected a different style: graffiti, abstract, realistic portraits, surreal landscapes. Some members argued they should just let the fence be, recognizing the positive press it brought to the neighborhood. Others insisted on continuing the fight, claiming it set a dangerous precedent for unregulated expression. The president of the HOA, who had been the most vocal critic from the beginning, was beginning to feel the pressure. Attendance at board meetings had skyrocketed, with residents demanding answers about wasted legal fees and declining property values. Ironically, those same declining property values, the HOA feared, were doing the opposite. Real estate agents had begun advertising nearby homes as steps away from the famous fence, and inquiries were pouring in from out-of-town buyers who loved the idea of living near something so unique. The HOA's claims of the fence being a community blight were starting to sound hollow in the face of actual numbers. Then, the tipping point arrived. A travel blogger with millions of followers posted a video titled, "The Fence That Beat the HOA," and within days, the story exploded nationwide. News crews set up cameras in front of the property, interviewing visitors and filming sweeping shots of the colorful planks. It wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. It was a viral sensation. The pressure was unbearable. With the entire country seemingly rooting for the fence, the HOA's reputation was in free fall. Sponsors for their annual neighborhood gala pulled out. Members of the board resigned in embarrassment. The president, once so confident in their authority, found themselves avoiding public appearances altogether. Finally, At a tense emergency meeting attended by more residents than anyone could remember, a motion was introduced to dissolve the HOA altogether. Years of built-up frustration over nitpicky enforcement, petty fines, and overreach came spilling out, and the vote passed by a landslide. The HOA, which had ruled over the neighborhood with rigid control, was gone in a single evening. The fence, now free from any threat of removal, stood as a permanent reminder of what had happened. Over time, it continued to evolve, new artists, new designs, new stories layered over the old. It became more than just paint on wood. It became a symbol, not just for that neighborhood, but for anyone who'd ever been told to keep their creativity in check for the sake of rules. Years later, when the homeowner was asked in an interview if they had ever expected things to turn out this way, they simply smiled. The fight had started over a simple coat of paint, but it had grown into something much bigger. A stand against control, a victory for individuality, and proof that sometimes the most unsightly things are exactly what the world needs to see. The fence had started as an eyesore. It ended as a legend. 24.